715,000 Russian troops. That is not a number pulled from a propaganda sheet. That is the verified combined force strength of every Russian military unit currently deployed across the eastern and southern fronts of Ukraine. And, as of 72 hours ago, every single one of them is operating in a state of strategic confusion that Moscow has not seen since the first weeks of this war. What happened was not simply a missile strike. It was not a battlefield skirmish. Yet what Ukraine executed in a 48-hour window was the most coordinated, multi-vector offensive operation this conflict has produced. And if you think the goal was to destroy a few logistics depots, you are not seeing what Kyiv actually built this attack to accomplish. Stay with me, because the real objective is not what the headlines told you. On the surface, the reports coming out of the front line looked familiar. Our Ukrainian forces launched a series of long-range strikes targeting Russian command infrastructure in the occupied territories. Explosions were confirmed in Luhansk, in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, and deep inside Crimea. Russian military bloggers, the same Telegram channels that Russia's own general staff monitors for battlefield sentiment, began reporting chaos in supply chains. Ammunition transfers were being rerouted. Fuel convoys were halted. On several forward operating bases went dark on Russian communication frequencies for hours at a time. That is what the surface looked like. That is what the news cycle covered. But every single one of those events was a symptom. The actual disease Kyiv just unleashed on the Russian military is something far more calculated and far more dangerous to Moscow's ability to hold what it currently occupies. Let me rewind to what set this in motion. Because the strike did not begin with the missiles. 3 weeks before the assault, Ukrainian military intelligence, what Kyiv formally designates as the HUAR, began receiving an extraordinary volume of intercepts from inside Russian forward command structures. According to two separate defense intelligence sources, cited by the War Zone and corroborated by reporting from Defense Express Kyiv, the intercepts revealed a critical Russian miscalculation. After months of incremental advances in Donetsk, advances measured not in kilometers but in destroyed city blocks, Russian theater commanders had begun rotating their most experienced assault units off the front line for what they internally classified as a consolidation and refit period. The logic was understandable from a Russian standpoint. These units, primarily drawn from the 8th Combined Arms Army and elements of the 58th Army, had absorbed catastrophic losses in the grinding urban battles around Avdiivka's successor positions. They needed time. They needed equipment. They needed replacements integrated before the next push. What they did not anticipate was that Ukrainian intelligence was watching every single movement of that rotation in real time. This is where the external catalyst arrives, because Ukraine did not act alone on this window. Beginning in early February, the satellite imagery contracted through commercial providers and shared within NATO intelligence sharing frameworks began capturing an unmistakable pattern. Russian engineering units, specifically the bridge-laying and logistics construction battalions that Russia deploys to prepare for large-scale offensive operations, had begun pre-positioning equipment in 3 distinct corridors north of the current front line. The assessment coming out of Western analytical centers, including the Institute for the Study of War, was stark. Russia was not consolidating. Russia was preparing. The rotation of experienced assault units was not a rest cycle. It was a staging cycle. Moscow was pulling its most capable units back, refitting them with newly manufactured T-90M tanks and upgraded infantry fighting vehicles, and intending to reinsert them at a single, overwhelming focal point within 60 to 90 days. The target, according to the ISW's February assessment, was almost certainly the Kharkiv axis, a thrust that, if successful, would force Ukraine to redeploy significant defensive assets away from the Donetsk front, thinning an already stressed line at exactly the moment Russia planned to push hardest in the south. Ukraine saw this, Ukraine understood this, and Ukraine made a decision that most conventional military doctrines would have rejected as premature. Rather than wait for the Russian offensive to begin and absorb the first blow, the reactive posture that had defined much of 2024, Ukrainian command, in a strategic decision that military analysts are now describing as a doctrine-level shift, chose to strike the preparation rather than the execution. Hit the staging areas, hit the command nodes, hit the supply architecture that makes a 60-day refit possible. Do not fight the offensive. Destroy the offensive before it can be launched. And this is not a new concept in military theory. It has a name. In operational planning, it is called an interdiction campaign. And Ukraine just executed one at a scale and precision that has not been seen on European soil since the Second World War. The operational sequence began on the night of the 14th. Ukrainian forces, coordinating across at least 7 separate strike packages, he launched a simultaneous wave of attacks using Storm Shadow cruise missiles, supplied by the United Kingdom, alongside Scalp EG missiles from French stocks, domestically produced Neptune variants modified for land attack profiles, and a significant deployment of long-range kamikaze drone swarms operating on staggered timing to defeat Russian air defense sequencing. The simultaneous nature of the attack was deliberate and central to its design. Our Russian air defense systems, specifically the S-400 complexes and Buk M3 batteries defending the rear areas, operate on priority engagement protocols. When faced with a single large salvo, those systems work efficiently. When faced with 7 simultaneous vectors arriving across different azimuthal angles with mixed speed profiles, those systems do not fail, but they degrade, they prioritize. And in the gaps created by that prioritization, the highest value munitions reached their targets. What were those targets? The military press in Ukraine was initially vague, citing operational security. But within 36 hours, the picture clarified through a combination of Russian open-source military reporting, Ukrainian official statements, and satellite imagery analyzed by independent OSINT organizations, including Oryx and the Conflict Intelligence Team. At least 4 Russian brigade-level command posts were struck, but 3 of those strikes produced confirmed destruction of the command infrastructure: the communications hardware, the planning modules, the officers' staff quarters. One produced a confirmed strike on a Russian general-grade officer coordination meeting, details of which remain classified but were referenced obliquely in a Zelensky briefing on the 15th. Beyond the command nodes, Ukrainian strikes destroyed or severely damaged 14 confirmed fuel and ammunition pre-positioning depots across the staging corridors identified in the satellite imagery. The engineering equipment, the bridge layers, the road grading machinery, the prefabricated logistics infrastructure that Russia had been quietly assembling for 60 days, was hit in at least 6 locations. The Oryx tracking database, which requires photographic or video confirmation before registering a loss, added a minimum of 43 major pieces of Russian military equipment to its destroyed list within 48 hours of the operation's commencement. Let those numbers sit for a moment. 14 fuel and ammunition depots, 4 brigade command posts, 43 confirmed equipment losses in 48 hours. And here is the number that matters most to understanding why 715,000 Russian troops are now operating in disarray. Not just the units that were directly struck, but the entire force. And because what Ukraine destroyed was not just hardware, Ukraine destroyed the command and logistics architecture that ties a 715,000-man force together into a coherent fighting organism. When you sever command posts, you do not just kill the officers inside. You disconnect every unit below that command from the real-time intelligence picture, the updated operational orders, and the logistical allocation signals that tell forward units where their next resupply is coming from and when. Russian forces across the Eastern Front right now are not fighting blind, but they are fighting on significantly degraded information. And in a modern high-intensity conflict, degraded information at the operational command level does not produce confusion for a day. It produces confusion for weeks. Colonel Markian Vorobyov, a Ukrainian army spokesperson cited by Reuters on the 16th, stated that Ukrainian forces had observed, and I am paraphrasing the translated statement here, a measurable reduction in the coherence of Russian fire coordination along multiple sectors of the contact line in the 24 hours following the strikes. That is military language for something specific and important. Fire coordination coherence is the measure of how well artillery, air support, and ground maneuver elements are synchronizing their actions. When it degrades, Russian artillery does not stop firing, but it fires less effectively. It fires on targets that may no longer be occupied. It fires in support of advances that the infantry on the ground no longer knows it is supposed to be making. The Russian soldier in the trench does not know that his brigade headquarters was hit 200 kilometers behind him. He only knows that the orders are not coming, that the artillery is landing in the wrong places, and that the resupply vehicle that was supposed to arrive yesterday has not appeared. That is what disarray looks like from the inside. Now shift to the strategic layer, because this is where the Ukrainian calculation becomes either brilliant or dangerously overextended. And the answer depends entirely on what happens in the next 30 to 45 days. Ukraine did not execute this operation simply to set back a Russian offensive by 60 days. If that were the goal, the operation would have been designed differently, more conservative, more focused purely on the logistics chain. The fact that Ukrainian planners chose to strike command infrastructure simultaneously tells us something about the longer objective. Kyiv is not trying to delay. Kyiv is trying to reset. There is a doctrinal difference between those two words that matters enormously. A delay buys time. So a reset forces the opponent to rebuild the entire operational architecture from scratch. New command personnel, new communications protocols, new logistics routing, new equipment allocation. A delay costs the opponent weeks. A reset costs the opponent months. And in this war, months matter differently than they did 2 years ago, because the political clock in Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv itself is no longer synchronized with the military clock on the front line. Let me explain the attrition mathematics that underpin this operation, because they are critical to understanding whether Ukraine's strategic gamble pays off. Russia, according to the latest assessment published by the Ukrainian General Staff and cross-referenced against independent estimates from the Kiel Institute and RUSI in London, has been absorbing approximately 1,100 to 1,300 casualties per day across all fronts. Those are not losses that stop Russian operations. Russia has demonstrated an extraordinary tolerance for human cost that no Western military doctrine accounts for adequately. But they are losses that degrade quality over time. The units Russia is currently staging for its next major offensive are the refit units, the ones pulled back from the worst of the Donetsk meat grinder to be rebuilt into something resembling a capable combined arms force. Those units represent Russia's best remaining option for a breakthrough operation. They are not replaceable in 60 days with equivalent quality. The conscript wave Russia mobilized in the autumn of 2022 is largely consumed. The contract soldiers who volunteered in 2023 fill the numbers but not the experience gap. The units being restaged right now are the units that still contain officers and NCOs who have survived 18 months of high-intensity combat and learned from it. And if those units' command and logistics infrastructure is destroyed before they can be reinserted into the fight, Russia faces a choice between delaying its offensive further, which costs it the strategic initiative it has spent 6 months purchasing at enormous human cost, or inserting those units without adequate preparation, which risks catastrophic losses that even Moscow cannot absorb politically. Ukraine just forced Russia into that choice, and the implications extend beyond the immediate front. Senior NATO military officials, speaking anonymously to Politico Europe on the 17th, described the Ukrainian strike package as, quote, operationally significant in ways that will not be fully visible for another 30 to 60 days. That timeline is deliberate. NATO is watching what Russia does next, specifically whether Moscow attempts to reconstitute the destroyed logistics infrastructure quickly, which would require diverting resources from other fronts and from the domestic defense production pipeline, or whether Russia accepts the delay and adjusts its offensive timeline outward. Either response tells NATO something valuable about Russia's actual strategic depth, not the depth Moscow projects, but the depth it actually possesses after nearly 3 years of continuous high-intensity warfare. Here is what the numbers tell us about that depth, and they are not reassuring for the Kremlin. Russia entered this war with approximately 3,500 main battle tanks in active service and a claimed reserve of an additional 10,000 in various states of storage. As of the most recent Oryx count, which tracks only confirmed photographic losses, Russia has lost over 3,200 tanks destroyed, damaged, or captured since February 2022. The reserve drawdown that began in 2023 has been supplying the front with T-72 and T-62 variants pulled from long-term storage, tanks that require significant refurbishment, and that are tactically inferior to the T-90M variants Russia was staging in those pre-positioning corridors. The destruction of the pre-positioned T-90M equipment in Ukraine's strike is therefore not simply a numerical loss. It represents a qualitative loss, a reduction in Russia's ability to field its highest capability armored vehicles at the decisive point of its intended offensive. Russia can replace the numbers. Russia cannot replace the quality on the same timeline. The artillery picture tells a similar story. Russia has fired an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 artillery shells per day at peak operational tempo, a rate that strains even Russia's industrial production capacity despite the war-footing manufacturing expansion ordered by the Kremlin in 2023. The fuel depots destroyed in Ukraine's strikes were not generic storage facilities. According to Ukrainian military intelligence cited by Defense Express, at least 3 of the 14 confirmed depot strikes targeted facilities specifically designated for the propellant and charge storage that Russian artillery units require to maintain that rate of fire. In practical terms, Ukrainian strikes may have reduced Russian artillery ammunition availability in the affected sectors by 15 to 25% for a period of 14 to 21 days. That is not a crippling reduction. Russian forces will still fire, but at a conflict intensity where every percentage point of artillery reduction translates into Ukrainian infantry lives saved in forward positions, 15 to 25% for 3 weeks is not a marginal gain. It is a significant tactical dividend extracted from a strategic investment.